Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here. Thank you to our guests, Dr. Gilmer and Mr. Wiley Cash. Thanks also to our wonderful Ollie at Duke Community Read Committee for selecting this book and collecting resources on our Community Read page. If you haven't been there, Bettina's going to put that link in the chat. I am Jenny Levine, Program Coordinator for Ollie at Duke, and it is my distinct honor to introduce today's guests. Wiley Cash is the New York Times bestselling author of 4 novels and the founder of This Is Working, an online creative community. He's been a fellow at Yaddo and the MacDowell Colony, and he teaches fiction writing and literature at UNC Asheville, where he serves as the alumni author in residence. He has published widely on issues ranging from the environment to history to foodways to music. He lives in North Carolina with his wife, photographer Mallory Cash, and their daughters. We have a link to Wiley Cash's site as well for more about him. Dr. Benjamin Gilmer is a family physician and associate professor at the UNC School of Medicine and Mountain Area Health Center's, that's MAHEC, Family Medicine Residency Program. He is an international Albert Schweitzer Fellow and attended Davidson College, followed by medical studies at the Sorbonne in Paris, France, and East Carolina University. As the medical director for MAHEC's Rural Health Initiative and Rural Fellowship, he is passionate about advocating for global and rural health disparities. He's worked extensively in Central and South America and West Africa. He's also the author of this fascinating and heart-wrenching true story. I have been at a loss as how to describe it to people I know, but I know for certain that it was clearly a labor of love, patience, and courage for Dr. Benjamin Gilmer. Due to a slight delay, Dr. Gilmer will be joining us shortly. Mr. Cash, you now have the floor.
Well, thank you so much, Jenny. And I'm glad that you introduced Benjamin as Dr. Gilmer. I also am a doctor. I'm a doctor of philosophy. So it's nice to be with another doctor today and finally get the respect that I deserve. When I got my PhD, I told my mom, I said, Mom, you know, I'm a doctor now, and I can't keep you out of the nursing home with my skills, but I can read to you once you get there. And so that's kind of how I've enjoyed my career as a doctor. Benjamin will be with us in just a little bit. He's traveling, and he texted us today or emailed us today, and he's passing through Chicago. He's going to get off the airplane. He's got a layover. He's going to run to the Delta Lounge, get online, and then he remembered that Chicago was in Central Time, and he was going to arrive a little bit late, not a little bit early. And this is exactly the kind of thing that I would do. And so when he told me this had happened, I just kind of laughed, and I promised that I would anchor us a little bit before he joined us. He has landed. He's off the plane. He's probably running to the airport, so he'll be here shortly. I wanted to say a few words about this book really quickly before he joins us, and I want to say a few words about another book that I've got some events going on with that are Ollie related in a moment. I found out about this book. Benjamin emailed me through my email address at UNC Asheville. This was probably 2 years ago. The pandemic felt relatively new at the time with the shuffle of time and chaos. I can't quite remember when it was exactly, but I had never met Benjamin before. And he said, my name's Benjamin Gilmer. I've got a new book coming out. I would love it if you would read it and offer a blurb. And what a blurb is it's what other authors say on the back of the book. And you can see my blurb right there. And I told him what I tell people when they ask me, I'll say yes for now, but I may run out of time. Something may come up. It's kind of a nice way of saying, I'll look at your book, but if I don't like it, that gives me an easy way just to say I ran out of time. And so he emailed the book to me in a PDF. And I was writing in my office, which means I was probably looking for ways to waste time and not actually write. And so I opened his email and began reading What is the Other Dr. Gilmer? And I read the introduction and thought, damn it, I'm going to read this entire book. And I took my laptop with me to lunch and sat in a booth in a restaurant. And I think I finished the whole book on my computer, which I don't normally read on my computer. I think I finished the whole book in just a couple of days, and I was blown away. And I know a couple of the other writers who blurbed this, Charles Fraser And we were all like, did you read that book yet? Can you believe the twists and turns in that book? I was just so amazed by how well written the book was, how revelatory it was, how suspenseful it was. But the farther I get from it, the more I'm able to kind of position the book in the zeitgeist of our contemporary moment. And that's what I like to do whenever I read, or I'm teaching a book, or I'm talking with an author. I ask myself, how does this book speak to where we are now in a country, in our country? And I think, we have issues of rural health. We have issues of the disparities in service for people suffering psychological impairment or difficulties in our legal system. We have problems with our correctional system here, our penal system here in America. But one thing that on a pop culture level that really appealed to me about this book is we are at the high water mark right now in America of true crime literature, true crime podcast, true crime documentaries, true crime literature, everything from the Murdaugh case down in South Carolina to the Golden State Killer to the Dahmer movie that was on one of the streaming services. We've reached the apotheosis of an obsession with true crime. And when I think about true crime, I think about, there is no such thing as victimless crime. There is no such thing as victimless true crime. And as a country, I feel like we've borderline fetishized murder and criminality and struggles with criminal behavior in our country. And when you watch a documentary like those that were on the Murdaugh murders, or you listen to a murder podcast, it's not treated as a straight-on story with victims and perpetrators and legal ramifications. It's treated like entertainment. And once upon a time, documentaries were presented when filmmakers just turned on the camera and interviewed people and maybe had some context. Well, now if you watch a documentary, there is music played that cues you to be nervous. There is music played that cues you to be suspicious of certain people. There are certain edits that are performed that steer you one way or another, because the goal of those kinds of documentaries are to hook you, to keep you streaming, to keep you to watch the next thing that's coming up on HBO. And Benjamin didn't give way to any of that. He really presented a humane, ethical portrayal of true crime. And that's something that I've thought more and more about since reading this book. And I've probably read it 3 times now. I actually featured it. I teach up at UNC Asheville, and I work with our Ollie Center there quite a bit. And I run something called the Common Word Community Read through our Ollie Center. And every semester I choose a text and I create 3 programs, 3 lectures around that text. And I chose Benjamin's book for our spring text last year. And the last event was Benjamin and me in conversation. But we had a lecture on the ethics of the true crime genre. We had a lecture on mental health and the US prison system. This semester, while we're waiting on Benjamin to arrive, and I think he'll be here at any moment, this semester, the text I've chosen is I Came as a Shadow. It's the autobiography of Coach John Thompson, who was the longtime coach of the Georgetown Hoyas. Some of you Dukies, some of you Tar Heels. You Tar Heels really remember John Thompson in 1982 when they beat the Georgetown Hoyas for the national championship. But this book is outstanding. It's a book on leadership. It's about the politics of higher education, the politics of sports, the politics of politics. It's a breathtaking book. And we have some events that I'd like to share with you. I'm going to put them in the chat right here. We've got some events coming up a week from tomorrow, October 26th. You can watch this virtually as well if you follow this link. We are hosting Dr. Adam Rothman, who's a professor of history at Georgetown. And Dr. Rothman has been tracing the descendants of the 272 enslaved people that Georgetown sold in 1838 to keep the university's doors open. And John Thompson writes about that in his book. And he says, you have to understand that I took a job. I was the first Black coach at a school that sold people who looked like me to keep their doors open. And they might have, he says that some of them might have been related to me. He was from Prince George's County. Many of those people were as well. But Dr. Adam Rothman's research traces the descendants of these 272 people to see how that event affected their lives. And so he'll be with us. You can follow the link that I put up here and join us virtually. It's a week from tomorrow at 7 p.m. And then on Thursday, November 16th, you can also watch this virtually. I'll be in conversation with Eric Sleepy Floyd, who played under Coach John Thompson. He played in the NBA for 14 years. He was an all-star, but he played 4 years at Georgetown and was on that team in 1982 that UNC beat. He and James Worthy were rivals. They both came out of Gastonia, North Carolina the same year. And of course, Worthy went to UNC and Sleepy Floyd went to Georgetown. But Coach Thompson writes in his autobiography, he said, Sleepy Floyd was the best scorer I ever coached. And we have to keep in mind that John Thompson coached Patrick Ewing. He coached Allen Iverson. He coached quite a few incredible players. But he said, if Sleepy Floyd was missing shots in a game, he would pull Coach Thompson aside and say, Coach, I think something's wrong with these rims. And he would really mean it. He would really think something was wrong with the rims. So I'll be with Eric Floyd and we'll talk about Coach Thompson's legacy, what it was like to learn and to play under the first Black coach in Georgetown's history. And so it should be a lot of fun. Oh, thanks, Gene. That's how you heard about Dr. Gilmer's book. Oh, awesome. But it'll be a lot of fun. And then we've got others coming up, but those are the two that I want to tell you about now. So Benjamin should be joining us at any second. I was hoping that he would have been here by now, but I heard y'all talking about other books that you've read, and not that this is my event, but I think somebody is reading When Ghosts Come Home right now. I think they wanted to ask me a question or about a book that I have coming out next year. Hopefully next year. That seems a little soon, but maybe not. We'll see.
I think that was the question.
Wiley, can you hear me okay? I just
Perfect
joined.
timing. I just got done making my pitch. We don't have to talk about me at all. Dr. Gilmer's here.
I would love to hear more about Wiley Cash.
No, I'm done. I'm talked out. I'm getting laryngitis. Benjamin, I'm glad. Welcome to Chicago.
Thank you. I'm so sorry I'm late. I apologize.
No, you didn't miss hardly anything. They just gave it to me, and we're moving on. So I think quite a few people have read the book. Our hosts have certainly read the book. I've read the book several times. And starting out today, and it's probably going to feel weird to you to be sitting in an airport lounge talking about yourself within earshot of other people, but I'm still going to ask you to do that. Can you tell us a little bit about who you were before you were the other Dr. Gilmer? What was your life like before you found yourself working in the clinic and taking the job with Mayhec?
I was a student for years, and that was my circuitous route that kind of landed me from a career in neurobiology to a career in family medicine. And so before that, I took 10 years off between undergraduate school and medical school, and tried to pursue some other things that I wouldn't have had the opportunity to do. So I lived in France for a while and worked in Africa and Central and South America. And those were experiences that really helped define who I am trying to be right now.
Can you talk about your work in rural parts of other continents, and then talk about, did you already have a heart for rural medicine before you went to Africa or South America? Or was that something that took root there that you were able to pursue in Western North Carolina?
Yeah, I was surprised because I had never pursued like rural medicine before. I'd grown up in Charlotte mostly and wanted to do urban emergency medicine. And so um, traveling to East Carolina and being exposed to the east of 95 was a really big awakening to me. And that kind of led to this other discovery of Africa and Central America, which revealed like what primary care is, because I hadn't fully understood that, and the power of like taking care of a community and becoming an advocate in a community. So it was a surprising twist for me to move in that direction, because I just had never prepared for it. But it helped to land me in a place where I've been able to grow up, and that's the clinic of King Creek, where Vince started his professional life.
Yeah, can you tell us a little bit, and you write about it, I'm not quite sure where it is in the book, but early on in the book, about your journey to Cane Creek and how you found out about the clinic, and just kind of the meted out information that you learned about Vince, not only as a doctor, but his crime, and then kind of the shock of it. But can you just walk us through the process from the beginning? That you do such a great job of it in the book, at the job interview, where you start to kind of learn things. Can you talk about that?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're kind of going in and out a little bit, but I can hear you.
Sec, let me just click in and out of that Bluetooth. How about that?
That's good.
Is that better? Good.
That's good.
Yeah. So trying to land in a rural place, in a rural clinical setting, like it was not what I had intended to do. And so the discovery through really the fact that this was the only place that was available for me to work in academics and kind of rural Western North Carolina at the time was just by chance that's where I landed. And that's sort of how this whole experience with the other Dr. Gilmer has felt, like that it started as by chance, but then later became something more than chance. Like it felt that becoming a part of this rural community was more than just an act of random hazard, that it was sort of it became destiny to be there for me. And that's how I sort of accepted it. And, the journey of learning more about this predecessor who had committed this violent act, and discovering that I was walking in his footsteps, and that this would be a really strange way to start a career in medicine.
What was, and I don't think I've ever asked you this before, how were people around you, either your colleagues or your staff, or even the administrators, how were they walking on eggshells around you when you first took the job that Vince had left behind? What was that feeling like, being the new guy who was walking in the shoes of not only the founder of the clinic, but this great tragedy that the founder had happened at the founder's hands? What did you feel like as a new person? Just, your sense of self in those early months.
I mean, many people didn't want me to be there first, and so that was awkward. Like, many of the administrators didn't want me to be there, and then many of the other people had sort of like had intentionally forgotten about what happened. Like, it was sort of brushed under the rug. And so when I started to poke around and ask questions, it felt a little bit uncomfortable for myself, but it also felt a little bit uncomfortable for some of the leaders in the organization. And I was trying to make sense of like what that all meant, both for me as a student in that clinic, in a way, like, and also trying to acknowledge that my mentors there some of them were not interested, because this seemed like a risk prone, moment, like, to get closer to this guy. And so that many of them told me, "Oh, you should not pursue trying to get to know the other Dr. Gilmer better. You need to focus on yourself. You need to focus on your patients. You need to do your job." And so there was a little bit of dissonance there, coming from the people that I really, were my mentors, and people who were telling me that I shouldn't be concerned about this. Whereas in my heart, I was very concerned about this. Like, I was starting to identify with the other Dr. Gilmer, someone who was more than a mystery. He was a human being that his patients and their stories, like, were hard to resist listening to because they believed in him so much. And that was really the impetus that pushed me forward, and it kind of enabled me to get beyond the administration and some of my colleagues who told me this was like fool's gold to try to figure out what happened to this man, and that it was risky.
And so I think before you were curious about Vince, you were in the book you write really openly about how scared you were. And some of that was maybe some teasing from the staff, but some kind of weird interactions you had with some of his former patients. Also, kind of the mystery around how he had suddenly become so violent and done something so out of character. And I talked about at the top of our time together, Benjamin, about how this is an ethical true crime book because you're so honest. You're so honest about your own fear. You're so honest about the emotional toll and the psychological toll this takes on your family once you get to know Vince. But for now, can you talk a little bit about your real fear and the impact this had on you early on in your time at Cane Creek?
Well, at first I didn't fear like the other Dr. Gilmer. It was more of a curiosity. And then there was one patient ultimately who said, "Hey, he's getting out of prison. He's going to want to come after you because you stole his life. Like you took his clinic. You assumed the riches, that he was having. Like you took his patients away from him. Like, of course he's going to come after you." And that was a startling thing for me. I hadn't really thought about that before. I've been sort of imagining him as this friendly ghost in the building, and that and trying to put together why I, in my heart, felt that something wasn't right with him. And so that kind of unleashed like this period of paranoia where my family was worried about it and telling me to leave and stuff like that. It was the first time I'd actually had the experience of feeling like paranoid like that. And part of it, I think, was because of like the privilege that I have grown up in, and like never experienced being close to a murder, never experienced the thought of someone else like intentionally coming after me. And so when your mind kind of gets the best of you sometimes if you let it go to those dark places, and it was a new novel like experience for me to have those moments. And so for a period of time I was very nervous, and that ultimately propelled me to make a commitment to either stay there or not. And I knew that if I stayed there, I needed to understand who this person was and to get to the bottom of it, to have peace and some kind of resolution.
And that led you to, reach out to him. Can you talk about the process of reaching out to him and some of your early interactions with him, whether it's the letter, the response letter, or even traveling to see him?
Yeah, so after joining forces with the journalist Sarah Koenig, who works for NPR's This American Life, together we kind of came up with a plan about how to pursue this journalistic process. And for me, this was like a commitment to a deep dive inquiry that I was realizing was about discovering who the other Dr. Gilmer was, but was realizing it was also a discovery about who I was. And I tried to be honest about that in the book, to reflect on, the fact that I was discovering Vince Gilmer and his dark past, but that I was also trying to make myself vulnerable to uncover who I was and how this was affecting me in the moment. And those two things kind of collided with the inquiry, with writing this letter to Vince and getting his response back, which I was pretty nervous about at the time. And then the note was like a madman's scrawl. It was like hard to decipher, and I could make out little words: aggression, kill, SSRI, this, and then the last words were, "Please help me." And that was a moment that kind of humanized this person that I didn't know yet, but humanized this person who was perhaps in need. And so that began our relationship together, which has now lasted for over 10 years.
And the line on Vince at his trial, and you found this. I mean, you really, I really don't see how you did it, Benjamin, where you were, working a relatively new job. Then at night you were looking at trial transcripts, you were working with Sarah, you were doing all of this stuff. But the more you read about the trial transcripts, the more you read the trial transcripts and the notes, the more you saw evidence of Vince really being in crisis during the trial, and that crisis being overlooked. And so when you received that letter from him, and then when you met him in person, he had been accused of malingering, which is legalese for faking a condition. Can you talk about how the man that you met the first time was essentially reminiscent of the man in the trial transcripts? Can you talk about discovering the injustice that had been perpetrated against him at his own trials?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I'm in Chicago, because tomorrow we're going to present Vince's case to the American Association of Psychiatry and Law. So this is like the biggest body of forensic psychiatrists and professionals in the country who we're all gonna sort of dissect the trial to some extent, and look back, retrospectively at how it was carried out, and the injustice that was ultimately carried out. But for me, reading the trial transcripts was like reading this crazy novel. Like it would take a master fiction writer like yourself to even make it up, because it was so insane. And there it became like very clear to me that like Vince was not in his right mind at the time, and that he was exhibiting grandiose thinking. He had fired his lawyers. He was referring to himself as a savant who could do a better job at representing himself. He was putting himself up on the stand as an expert witness for himself, to make testimony of this SSRI discontinuation syndrome. So it was the biggest farcical act that any like avid CSI watcher would have like deciphered very immediately that something was very wrong here. He fired his lawyer, and the lawyer he fired sat and watched this travesty unfold, and described it as like watching someone kill themselves with a butter knife. It was excruciating. Meanwhile, the prosecution, the judge, and the jury all did their jobs. Like they prosecuted and sent him away. The saddest part for me was that throughout the trial, especially towards the end, he made a plea that he wanted to be reevaluated, that he was not the person, he was not of sane mind at the time, and that he was not able to continue going on with the trial. And so that was a very hard thing to witness. But overall, unfortunately, it was a constitutional trial, but it was one that was personally really, really hard to watch and hard to read about, for sure.
And then you go to meet him in prison, and can you talk about what you found the first time that you met Vince? Not only with Vince's mindset and physicality, but also in the way that the people in the prison treated him and kind of viewed him. And also give us a timeline. If I believe Vince's trial was in 2004, if I'm not mistaken. And the first time you met him, traveled to prison to meet him, would have been when?
So that would have been in 2012.
2012. So it had been quite a while since the crime and the trial. But can you talk about where he was mentally, emotionally, physically, and then how you got the sense that he was being treated in prison at that first meeting in 2012?
Yeah, so the first meeting was very interesting because the person that I saw when he approached us was very much the same person that he was in trial, during his trial. He was shaking. These were how the detective believed that he was a malingerer, and he was exhibiting these symptoms of shaking, these kind of dyskinesias, this cognitive, blunting, his poor speech, his poor memory, all these things. were the same behavior that I witnessed when I saw him for the first time. And so he had not changed. Like he had been, they had believed that he was faking these symptoms for almost 10 years in prison. And so, we knew that that could not be right. But what I saw was a very frail man, a man who like's 10 years older than his actually stated age. And when he came over, I didn't know what to expect exactly from him, but what I witnessed was a man who was like desperately trying to stay alive, someone who had been living in and out of solitary confinement, a man who had been beaten many, many times, a man who had no teeth, a man who was like just fighting for survival in prison. And that was a really difficult thing for me to witness. And ultimately that was really lit a spark, like a transformative spark for me that led to a deeper kind of appreciation for what mass incarceration is. I'd never been to a prison before, never even imagined going to a prison before. It's unleashed so quite a bit of anxiety at the time too. It's something I'd never experienced before in that capacity, and ultimately, turned him into a patient for me. So at that time, I like completely, pivoted towards thinking of him as a cold-blooded murderer, which is how the judge described him, and thinking about him as a patient, and then kind of reflexively putting my doctor hat on to take care of him, or at least to have a better understanding of what was going on with him. But it was clear in that initial moment, and after seeing him again in prison, that something was not right. It's like that he either had a deeply psychiatric issue, a deeply neurologic one, or maybe he was like a sociopath. Like that would be the only way to kind of keep up the charade for 10 years. One of those three options.
So what was that process like, making that shift from thinking he's a cold-blooded murderer to seeing him as someone who is about to be, because of you, diagnosed with neurological, there's stuff going on, but also someone who's faced great trauma, childhood trauma, war trauma, PTSD. What is that process like that, for you, looking at someone who's not your patient? He became your patient of sorts, but is that something that you find you're able to do now when you look at something on the news and somebody has done something horrible or something bizarre? Are you able now, has it kind of reframed your approach as a doctor, but maybe just as a human and as a citizen? When you think about Vince's case, I don't know if I'm making sense, but has it let you kind of reframe causality, I guess?
I mean, the big reframe for me initially was recognizing that I had a lot of bias about his case. And the first bias I had was that he had a traumatic brain injury, and that had precipitated like this bizarre behavior that led to the killing.
Because he'd been in a car accident.
And that because he had been in a car accident 6 months before. But then it made me think about a lot of it, different biases that I had, and it made me sort of question like the deeply ingrained bias that we all share about things. And it made me question, my own brain, and whether my judgment was actually appropriate, and whether or not I could overcome my own bias, and I could feel like my brain wanting to shift back to the easier understanding of him, that he was a cold-blooded murderer, and really like battling to see him through like a tabula rasa, to see him as someone completely different, and to see him as someone who is human. And I just finished reading this great book that y'all should read, called The End of Bias by Jessica Nordell, and it's an amazing story about our own brains and how we are also biased. And I didn't realize how biased I was, both as a person and as a physician. We walk into our patients' rooms and we think we know the diagnosis before we even talk to the patient. Like that's how our brains work. Like the same thing was true with Vince. And so pivoting towards this new understanding that he was a patient rather than a murderer was a big shift for me. And it taught me a lot, I think, about challenging the way I think challenging my own understanding about things, and being more intentional about trying to do that.
Mhm. So can you talk a little bit about some of the work you've done more recently, and some of the challenges that Vince is still facing, as much as you can without giving away everything in the book? But I think a lot of people here have read it, but some of the more recent challenges in the past couple of years.
So I thought that getting him out of prison was going to be easy, because we ultimately did, confirm a diagnosis. We ultimately elucidated like 5 other reasons why he had this perfect, like, dark neurologic storm. Um, so I was very naive in thinking that this would be an easy journey to get him out of prison. And in fact, it's turned out to be the opposite. And part of the journey of writing the book, and part of the sort of visioning experience that the book took me on while writing it, was trying to understand, like, the system and what we can do about it. It's like recognizing that 40 to 50% of incarcerated people suffer from severe mental illness, and trying to make sense about what is my role as a doctor to say something about that. Like, it felt like an an absolute imperative, if, as a moral person, as a someone trying to be a humanistic person, that this is something that we had to pick up and fight for. So despite, like, all of the media opportunities we've had, despite a law firm that dumped $1 million into this case, despite 10 years of work, it took like 3 different governors to look at Vince's case, 2 of whom rejected our clemency petition. So the book is also about kind of this adventure to discover how to get someone out of prison through clemency. And then realizing that it's all about politics, and that it's all about media, and that it's not all about a patient with a terminal illness who's suffering in prison. It's not about any of those things ultimately. And that was really startling. Like, that was disheartening. It was disparaging. It was demoralizing. Um, and that's what led to the book. Like, the book was, for me, was to make sense of all that, and to put something in the hands of the governor that would help change his mind. And 6 months after the governor Northam in Virginia rejected our petition for clemency, he granted it after I dumped a bunch of books in the governor's office. It was a few weeks later, on his last day in office, that he did it. So I thought that was victory. I thought we had won. But then I learned that we didn't win, and that the enemy wasn't entirely like the judicial system. It wasn't the judge. It wasn't the prison. It wasn't the forensic psychiatrist who condemned Vince, who made a misdiagnosis. That it was actually our hospital system. So I thought that it would be easy, like, to convince a hospital to take Vince. And so this has been really like the fourth act of this story, is realizing that our hospital system is equally as broken as the prison system, and trying to convince a hospital to take Vince has been very, very hard. Even having many connections as an academic physician in North Carolina, it's been very, very hard. We've had rejection after rejection after rejection until very recently. Yet we're still battling to get him over the goal line at this point. So yeah, it's been really disappointing as a physician to realize that we oftentimes put profits over patients, and that we don't always make decisions that are based on the humanism that we all accepted as physicians, and the Hippocratic Oath that we all took. That it's much murkier and complicated space.
How is Vince? One question I've asked you before: how is Vince doing now? And a question I've never asked you: what did Vince think about the book?
Well, I really was very intentional about writing the book for him. Like, I wanted to honor him. I wanted him to feel people recognizing him for who he was, like for his entire life, not just for that one moment, because his life has been completely defined by that one moment. And so I really wanted people to see him for the human that he was, and the amazing efforts that he made throughout his life, like to serve a rural community. So, I wanted it to uplift him. Like I wanted him to see it as a victory march, like as a vindication of what had happened. And that was successful. I think like he really enjoyed it. He read the whole thing many times, and that's been a great joy. Like that he appreciated it, because it's, as you know, it's a difficult tightrope to walk when you're talking about real humans, lives in a story, and you're using their names, and you're revealing very intimate, dark secrets about him and other people, other characters in the book as well. It's an uncomfortable space, and I wanted to tell it in a way that enabled the truth, and to his truth and my truth, but I also wanted it to be to be an honoring tale of his life and the tragedy that happened.
How is he doing now? Can you give us an insight on his current condition or his spirits?
He's not doing well. He's lost 75 pounds over the last several months. We're really, really close to getting him out. We're just waiting on the Attorney General in Virginia and the parole board to give their final accord. But we have a hospital that's waiting for him. We have Mellow Mushroom Pizza, who's waiting to deliver pizza to the whole floor where he'll be. We have friends and his family that are waiting to greet him and to see the rebirth that can happen. So that's kind of the fifth act of the story, is like, how is this man going to respond to living outside of prison and to living with this terminal disease, and will he be able to build back some of who he used to be? So we're all very excited, like, to see what happens to him and to see how he responds to to the world again. Yeah, we're so close. We're
so close.
We've
got a couple of questions here. Ginny has a question to start us off. Ginny asks, you were trained as a doctor, not a writer. It seems like your connection to Vince really compelled you to put his story out there. How were you able to tackle such a big endeavor? Especially working, Benjamin, your work schedule, and then to write a book like this? That's a great question.
So as you know, Wiley, like, writing is really hard. Like, and I floundered in a dark room for a long time. Like, after the clemency petition was rejected, I became so deeply angered that it gave me immense motivation to just really go for it. And at that point, I'd sort of traversed this threshold where I didn't care about writing with vulnerability. I had fully embraced, like, the vulnerability that accompanies writing and getting feedback from lots of people. And so I invited lots of people to help me. I invited family to read. I eventually connected with an agent who helped me with a writing coach, and that was a really beautiful experience. So I had to also be very disciplined. So I wrote between 5 a.m. and 7 a.m. before work, and that was my sort of sacred space. Like, that was the space where I became, like, that I loved, because it was an opportunity to jump into the right side of my brain, which I'd completely forgotten about. And so I have to say, the writing process, at first I thought about it as an immense challenge that was, like, horrific. It sounded like a horrific endeavor, but I loved it as an escape, as an opportunity to pursue the creative process, and to get a lot of help from people. People like Brent Stevenson and Atul Gawande, and then ultimately, so gracious for you jumping in to give your feedback and to write a blurb for the book. But it was kind of a team effort. I really just jumped in and invited and invited everyone to give as much feedback as possible. I can't wait to do it again. I have to tell you that.
Gene asks, is there any way we can help Vince at this point? Would it help to write to the North Carolina Attorney General, for example?
I will say that the Josh Stein, our Attorney General, has been very gracious and responsive. Like we called him a few weeks ago. He called the Attorney General of Virginia directly, and so he's been very very prompt, and our regional senators have been very engaged as well. But I love your question, Gene, and one thing that I would ask all of you actually is his spirits are very low right now. He's still like literally fighting to survive these next weeks or months. If you wrote a letter to the prison, that would be immensely helpful to him. I mean, that's so just a brief note, and on my website, which is benjamingilmer.com, there's a tab, and Jenny, I'll send it to you if you like. There's a tab that says Help Vince, and there is the address of the prison and his prison ID number. So if any of you feel it in your heart to reach out to him, he would love it. Like it would mean a lot. Yeah.
And then Gene's got a follow-up question. How did Vince's former patients react to the book? So yeah, I've never asked you that either. What was the reaction in the Cane Creek Clinic?
The patients were, I mean, they've been dumbfounded by this whole thing for years. And so for them, it was an opportunity to kind of read through and see the whole lens of what was happening in his brain. And also to realize that, this is something that could happen to any one of us, like that we're all cognitively fallible. We're all vulnerable. And, Vince's perfect storm led to his predicament. And so I think the book has been really helpful to his patients to see the person that they knew in their hearts was him, and that this was not an intentional murder. It was like the unraveling of a very fragile brain in a very difficult time, of course compounded by the intense sexual abuse that he had endured with his father. So I wrote the book in many ways too to explain to them, to Vince's family and friends, to exonerate what had happened to him, and to explain that that we're all vulnerable, we're all cognitively fallible, we all have biases, and that this is kind of the first step in my mind to moving towards healing. And then the last chapter of the book I write about healing crime, which is how we can sort of re-envision what it means to heal someone or to punish someone, and how that's so important, especially in this time.
We have another question here from Ray. Ray says, I thought it was very brave of you to include your children in your visits to the prison. How did you reach that decision?
It wasn't really a decision. It just felt like what we were all doing together. Like we were a family, all in the same boat. Like we were all, my children were little mini advocates, when they were 4 and 6, when they first went to the prison for the first time. And so they, I couldn't have done this. I couldn't have stayed engaged this intensively and this long without my family. And so the kids have been a big part of that. My wife, Deirdre, has been a big part of that. So it didn't feel like I was putting them at risk. It felt like I was giving them a unique experience that would be hopefully instructive. And it really has. My kids they can articulate why we should not mass incarcerate mentally ill people better than I can. They're so savvy about these things. And I guess the example of pursuing advocacy too for them it's been a big thread of the family, and they get it. I mean, it's been hard too. I've been away from the family a lot, and as a distracted person neurobiologically, it's been hard to to focus on 80 hours at work, and then to focus on trying to figure out what a story like Vince's should mean and how we can use it as a tool for advocacy. But they've all been really important part of the journey.
Well, I think that's it for us, Benjamin. Those were some great questions, and it's always so fun doing these events with you. Ray wants to know real quick, are you still in touch with the This American Life crew?
Yeah, I talked to Sarah Koenig a few weeks ago. we're hoping maybe to do another episode just to kind of talk about life after prison and to sort of document Vince getting out. Vince's case, of course, led to the podcast that Sarah did called Serial. Many of you may have listened to that. And Vince's, yeah, I never imagined like that Vince's story, like our podcast would have over 20 million listeners. It still kind of baffles me to think about that. But Sarah's been really helpful along the way too, like giving me tips about how to use media, how to interface with media. And yeah, I hope that we will be able to tell that story together again. But we are doing a documentary right now, and hopefully a feature film as well, which will help reach more people and help people understand, what it means like to be an advocate and what it means to be a human and what it means to sort of sort our human brains out and realize that in order to heal crime, like there has to be a greater intentionality to pursue compassion. And I think ultimately that's what Vincent's story is about.
We just had a couple more questions come in. If you can hang with us for a second, Benjamin.
Yeah.
Jane asks, what organizations effectively advocate for better mental health care in prisons in North Carolina?
I mean, there are organizations all over the country that are lots of different organizations advocating for against mass incarceration, speaking up for people who experience mental illness. Of course, all people who come out of prisons, like, ultimately experience some mental illness. At Chapel Hill, that we have an advocacy group that is working towards that. Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama, headed by Brian Stevenson, is like the most formidable voice. Our own psychiatric association in North Carolina, our own DHHS psychiatry director. Like, these are all people. Our DHHS Secretary of Health has been like immensely powerful in using his voice to advocate for mental health. And just this month, we've state of North Carolina is committing $750 million to devoting towards people who are experiencing mental illness, focusing on social justice reforms, trying to enable more access to care. And then my role in this is trying to create real doctors that will serve like the underserved communities of North Carolina. Because if you look at the numbers, they're really staggeringly low. They're less than 0.05% of psychiatrists in North Carolina practice in rural settings. So it's really abysmal. There's just not enough access to mental health, and so that's ultimately the biggest advocacy direction I think we can all make to solving this problem. But yeah, if you look around, there are many great advocates doing this work. That one of the problems I've discovered is that nobody's really communicating like on a mass level. So so many of us are in silos, and so trying to figure out how we can communicate better is have a more unified voice is going to be important as we move forward. But honestly, I really believe that North Carolina is going to be one of the great examples of mental health reform and hopefully, mass incarceration reform as well, moving forward.
We got two more questions. The last one is I want to know as well, but this is from Melanie. She asks, your description of the trial transcripts was astounding, that it was allowed to proceed when he was clearly not able to represent himself. In medicine, we would never allow a patient to do their own surgery or write their chemotherapy orders. How does this happen in the legal system? And before you answer that, Francis wants to know, do you know if the judge from Vince's trial has read your book or the sheriff who arrested him? You can answer those together.
Those are great questions. Yeah, I still struggle to understand how any human could have watched the trial and let it go on. And that for me comes back to like what lens you're peering through in life, and a prosecutor peers through a prosecutorial lens, and that was her job. She was executing her job, and it didn't matter really what was happening with Vince. It didn't matter that this trial was a farce. that's still hard for me to digest. I made a special appearance to the courthouse where I knew the judge was one day, and somehow the police let me up all the way up to his office, and I brought him a book, and I put it on his desk, and his secretary abruptly like kicked me out of the office and had the police escort me out of the building. But I hope that Judge Lowe read the book. I really hope he did. Detective Martin, who was our biggest foe, kind of in the beginning, has talked to us. We've interviewed him, and he has agreed that although he still believes that Vince is malingering, he still believes that Vince should be in prison for the rest of his life. He has not escaped that deeply seated bias, but he's been able to say, we can't solve this problem by ourselves. Like, the law enforcement needs other people, and I told him that well, medicine needs other people too. We can't solve this problem, and it has to be a community effort. And so we kind of like gave each other a hug in the end and had this bizarre reconciliation. But it was sweet and gave me some hope at the same time. And that I've wanted to ask each of the characters in the book if they were able to grow, if they were able to accept a new lens, or to eradicate the bias about that. And so I've contacted the psychologist who made the diagnosis initially, who deemed Vince to be competent and sane. And he's recognized that he made a mistake. And he recognized that Vince should never have set one foot in prison. And I could tell he felt really guilty about it, but the judge has not relinquished his bias yet. And I'm hoping to talk to Governor Northam soon, to get his experience, because he was a doctor, who was also trying to sort out, who this person was. And it's not easy. It's not easy for governors, I think, to read through like mounds of clemency petitions and to sort out like who is malingering, who's faking, who's real, who's not, like who should be in the prison system. But I just over the last 2 weeks have met this woman who was she's the head investigator of the parole board. So she's actually the one who makes like these decisions in Virginia. And she's someone that I've really demonized like over the years. Like, I felt like she was our nemesis, who for 2 different clemency petitions like denied us like the truth. And just last week we had an hour-long conversation where she kind of confessed to me that the first part of her career was putting people away. She was like a SWAT team member, and like a really committed like police officer, and her first half of her career was like putting as many people away as possible. And then she realized that one of the people she put away was not guilty, and had spent years in prison because of her work. And then she switched paths and tried to get that guy out, actually, and then later became an advocate for the governor's office and the parole board to get as many people out as possible. And so we kind of had this beautiful moment where I realized that she wasn't actually our nemesis, that she's actually trying to help Vince get out right now, and she holds the key to it all at this point. And that she was able to change her bias.
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't heard that story. Ginny, I will turn it back over to you, but before we do, Benjamin, Ginny wrote about how much she enjoyed you reading the audio book. So if you haven't read the book yet and you got some traveling to do, download the audio book. It's wonderful because Benjamin reads it. But thank you for doing this with me, Benjamin. Maybe we got more of these in our future.
Well, thank you as always, like, for stepping up and being with me. I have appreciated your leadership and your mentorship, and love reading your books.
Oh,
if you haven't read all of Wiley Cash's books, you need to do that. Yeah, I did it. I looked at many authors like while I was trying to learn how to read, and your books were really instrumental, actually. So
thank you.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
You guys have been wonderful, Dr. Cash and Dr. Gilmer. Thank you so much for being here. I can't believe you're going to be presenting this to the American Psychiatry Association. Is that correct? In Chicago. I wish I could be a fly on the wall for that and pass out books to everyone. lots of thank yous in the chat. This has been a incredible story. It's hard to believe it's still going on, and I just, the amount of patience you're forced to have to get through it is incredibly admirable. We're at the end of our time, and we recorded this program for folks. We'll get in touch with you. You can get in touch with me if you want to ask me how to get to that link or what was that book title. I'm here, jenny.levine@duke.edu. Anything else? Any final words? Thank you.
I appreciate you all inviting me. I wish we could have been in person together today. I apologize I was a little bit late.
Well, I appreciate you guys have been so great to work with, and I know that I can reach out to you and you can reach out to me if you have questions. We want to make this book be successful, and Vince's journey has clearly not been in vain. It's not over yet, but it's reached a lot of people, this story. So,
Jenny, I can send you some updates, but I'll be updating my website too if people are interested in kind of hearing the end of the story.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. Thank you for joining us, Ollie at Duke Community Read. It's been so great, educational, hard story, but we're lifelong learners, so we're happy to learn more. Thank you all. Bye-bye.